Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, a place where ideas don't need to hurry, where science breathes softly, and where curiosity is allowed to rest alongside wonder. Tonight, we're going to lean gently into a thought that doesn't come with any answers, only echoes. A quiet kind of question that might sound too strange to be true, until it doesn't. What if Earth tilted? Not a little, not just a wobble or a seasonal lean, but something else. Something slow, colossal, and almost impossible. What if Earth tilted 90 degrees? What if the planet we live on, this blue, breathing sphere beneath us, suddenly leaned sideways, turning its face toward the sun in a new, unrecognizable way? What if the North Pole pointed not up, but forward, staring at the horizon like a question left unanswered? What would it feel like to wake up in a world where east was no longer east? Where the sun didn't rise from where you expected, and shadows grew in strange, slanting silence? Could we survive it? Could we adapt? Or have we already done it once before without remembering? Tilt is not a stranger to this planet. Earth wobbles, Earth shifts, axial precession, obliquity, nutation, each a whisper in the language of time. The continents slide, the plates groan. The sky's calendar redraws itself over and over again. But a full 90 degrees? That would be something else entirely. Not a whisper, but a turning of the world's face. Imagine the equator running over Antarctica. Imagine tropical storms where glaciers used to breathe, and polar twilight stretched long and low across the Amazon basin. Rainforests under frost, deserts kissed by mist, the atmosphere itself spinning strangely, confused by its new instructions. This happened before. Maybe not fully, maybe not completely, but there are records, deep in stone, buried in silt, frozen in ice cores, that tell of ancient warmth near the poles, and sudden cold where life once flourished. We've found fossils of tropical trees beneath Greenland's snow, pollen frozen inside Himalayan glaciers, the remains of crocodiles fossilized in what is now the edge of Siberia. The past does not behave the way we expect it to, and maybe that's the quiet warning. Maybe Earth has done this before or tried. Maybe it's still doing it now, slowly, so gently we don't feel it in the space of a human life. But what is a life to a planet? Just a heartbeat, just a blink in a long, slow gaze. If Earth tilted 90 degrees, we wouldn't just feel it in the weather. We'd feel it in memory, in language, in myth, in the slow unraveling of calendars and crops and circadian rhythms. You might wake up and not know why your sleep feels different, why your garden won't grow the way it used to, why the moon looks wrong in the sky, still circling, still present, but somehow unfamiliar. Our bones remember gravity. Our minds remember the path of the sun. We know these things, even if we don't speak them. And if they changed, if they truly changed, would we even realize what we lost? And there's more. Beneath our feet, the mantle flows like glass, slow but alive. Plates push against one another like the memory of ancient arguments. And if Earth leaned, those plates would shift too, like the seams of a spinning top falling sideways. Mountains might rise where none existed. Cities might slip into the sea. And entire coastlines might crumble, not from violence, but from quiet collapse. Not because of punishment, not because of vengeance, but simply because balance had changed. Entropy doesn't rage. It sighs. It whispers. It waits. And somewhere in that whisper, a question remains. Could Earth be capable of remembering its own tilt? Not just through rocks or fossilized roots, but deeper still, in isotope ratios, in magnetic reversals, in the subtle curve of time embedded in every molecule of soil. Could the planet itself carry a kind of memory? One not written in words, but in weight, in warmth, in the way light bends through atmosphere and lingers longer in certain skies. What would it mean to live inside a planet's memory? To walk across a crust that recalls things we've never seen? And more than that, what if the tilt hasn't happened yet? What if it's coming? Or what if it's already begun? It wouldn't feel like disaster. Not right away. It might feel like a long season that never ends. like flowers blooming a month too early, or snow falling where no one remembers seeing snow. It might feel like losing something unnamed, a slow unease, a gentle undoing. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Perhaps the first thing we forget is that we are balanced. Not by choice, not by design, but by an ancient rhythm older than breath. A quiet, invisible spine holds us in place, not in our bodies, but in the very body of the world. Earth's axis. It isn't something we can see, and yet everything we know depends on it. A tilt of 23.5 degrees. Not upright, not sideways, just slightly askew, like a nod frozen in motion. That slight lean gives us everything. Spring and summer, twilight and migration, the length of a day, the memory of years. We owe seasons to that angle. We owe tides to the moon, yes, but even those shifting waters follow the lean. Climate dances around it. Winds follow it. Even the turning of forests from green to red, the folding of petals at dusk, the migration of whales beneath polar ice. All of it traces back to the axis. But what anchors that spine? What keeps it steady, or keeps it from breaking? The answer is strange. There is no pole nailed into the heavens. No tether holding Earth in place. Only motion. Only inertia. Only the spinning of the sphere and the slow resistance of everything it carries. A ballet, yes, but one balanced on impermanence. On compromise. The moon helps, stabilizes us gently. Its gravity tugs like a hand resting on a spinning top, keeping the wobble contained. But even that balance shifts. Slowly, slowly. Axial precession, the slow circle Earth's axis traces in space, takes nearly 26,000 years to complete. Like the wobble of a gyroscope leaning this way, then that. If you could stand still long enough, you'd watch the North Star change. Not because the star moves, but because we do. And it's not just wobble. Scientists call it true polar wander. A soft drift in the location of Earth's spin axis, caused not by the tilt itself, but by changes in how mass is distributed across the planet. Melting ice sheets, shifting magma, movement of water. Even human-made reservoirs, in their small way, can pull at that balance. Because Earth is not rigid. It is alive in slow ways. Soft, fluid, responsive. Its core spins faster than its crust. Its mantle flows like warm stone. Its outer shell is cracked and mobile. So what happens if that spine falters? Nothing all at once, but everything eventually. Tides would stretch in unfamiliar directions. Storms might last longer than they should. One hemisphere could see endless summer, while the other enters a cold it can't escape. The balance of energy would slip, and like any unbalanced system, feedback would begin. Ice reflecting heat, heat melting ice, ocean currents reeling, trying to remember where they once belonged. And we might feel it not in earthquakes, not in eruptions, but in rhythm, in sleep that won't settle, in harvests that don't behave, in calendars that seem slightly off, like the tick of a clock that's been wound too tightly, or not at all. If Earth's axis is the spine of time, then time itself would begin to limp. Still, it's hard to picture. It feels abstract until we remember that balance is never permanent. That even the sky, which feels so still, is not still at all. And this spine, this tilt, this gentle lean toward the sun, it wasn't always this way. Mars, too, tilts. But it tilts wildly, lurching between angles. The seasons are unpredictable. This memory of climate broken. Uranus lies on its side. A planet of sideways nights and years where the poles stare directly into the sun. Could Earth become something like that? Could a push, however slow, turn our gentle tilt into a fall? We don't know, but we wonder. And wonder, as always, leads us further. Because if something holds the axis in place, something else must threaten it. If the planet's spine can bend, then what force might try to break it? And if that force is already moving, already shifting deep beneath our feet, would we even know? Would we hear the silence before the change? Or would we only notice when the oceans forgot which way to flow? And if the balance can be disturbed from below, maybe we should ask ourselves, what lies beneath the crust, waiting to rise? Maybe flowers. Maybe forests. Maybe soft green things pushing up through soil that used to be frozen for centuries. Maybe a garden blooming where no root has ever dared to grow. If the world tilts, the poles move. Not the land itself, but the definition of cold, the location of light, the geometry of warmth. What we once called polar might become tropical. What we once knew as glacial might melt into meadow. And when that happens, everything changes. We imagine glaciers as fixed things, vast white sheets, ancient and unmoving. But they are not. They breathe, they grow, and they recede. And when the angle of Earth shifts, even slightly, the glaciers retreat. Or they arrive where they were never meant to be. Now imagine that happening on a tilted Earth 90 degrees from now. The old poles are caught in light they don't recognize. The new ones darken under skies that feel unfamiliar. And in between, climate bands stretch and warp like the colors in an oil spill. The tropics widen or shrink. Rain no longer falls in the same places, and forests wander. Could penguins migrate north? Could polar bears learn to stalk tropical fish? Perhaps not in the way we know them now. But species shift. Life adjusts. Slowly, yes, but persistently. Where ice vanishes, moss moves in. Where cold was once law, lichen creeps, then flowers. Tundra gives way to taiga. Taiga becomes forest. Forest becomes heat. There is evidence, quiet, ancient evidence, that Earth has done this before. Fossilized tree stumps frozen into the rocks of Antarctica. Leaf imprints beneath Greenland's ice. Microbes sealed in permafrost, still dreaming of the last time they swam through water warmed by sunlight. These aren't stories of the future. They're memories of the past. Deep time doesn't forget. Millions of years ago, the poles were lush. The Arctic was home to alligators. The Antarctic to forests dense with ferns. Oxygen was different. Carbon moved like a song, not a warning. Climate wasn't broken, it was fluid. It flowed like tidewater, pulled by things we still don't fully understand. Volcanoes, solar cycles, orbital shifts, perhaps even something deeper, something we haven't yet named. We often think of Earth as a globe divided into stripes, cold at the top, hot at the center, cold again at the bottom. But these are just temporary arrangements, temporary colors painted on a spinning canvas. And when the canvas tilts, the stripes smear. The garden blooms in strange places. Of course, with such blooming comes decay. Melting ice releases things we did not expect. Methane pockets, buried microbes, fossilized spores waiting for their chance to awaken. And not all awakenings are gentle. Biomes are like breath. You change the rhythm and everything begins to gasp. Trees that once flourished in sun may now drown in shade. Coral that danced in warm water may bleach under too much heat. Animals move, or fail to, and the edge of survival shifts. Still, in this imagined world, it's not all collapse. It is transformation. Where one species ends, another begins. Where old ecosystems dissolve, new patterns emerge. Seeds find cracks in unexpected stone. Insects explore unfamiliar petals. And perhaps, if enough time is given, balance finds a new expression. Imagine standing where the South Pole used to be, and seeing nothing but green. Trees taller than memory, air heavy with scent. The buzz of life where once there was only silence and snow. Imagine explaining that to someone from now. And yet, is it so strange? We already garden in strange places. On rooftops, in deserts, beneath the sea. Perhaps nature, too, learns to grow wherever it can. Perhaps the poles were never boundaries, just resting places between climates. If the earth leans, the garden follows. It stretches, it sprawls, it swallows ice and spits out pollen. It forgets the rules we wrote about it and writes its own. And we, curious, clumsy, awestruck humans, watch as the lines blur between frozen and fertile, between what was and what could be. And in this place where poles bloom, another question begins to rise. If life can grow where it was never meant to, then what else might emerge from stone? Perhaps the land itself would begin to move differently. Continents are not still. They never have been. What we walk on, the ground we think of as solid, is only a thin, cracked shell floating on a deeper current of molten motion. We call it lithosphere and mantle, as though giving it a name could make it less alive. But it moves. It breathes. It drifts. Now imagine that drift under a new kind of balance. If Earth tilted 90 degrees, gravity would still pull down, but down would feel unfamiliar. The forces that hold mountains upright and oceans in their basins would stretch and twist. Pressure would redistribute subtly at first, like weight shifting on a sleeping body. The continents would begin to respond. The plates, those vast rafts of crust, would feel new stress. Subduction zones might awaken in strange places, swallowing ocean floors where calm once reigned. Ridges might rise along unexpected scars. The map of the world would ripple, slowly, imperceptibly, but certainly. In geologic time, movement is never sudden. A few centimeters each year. A finger's width of motion in a lifetime. But give it 10 million years, and coastlines are rewritten. Oceans appear and vanish. Chains of mountains rise from the sea like memory surfacing from a dream. Perhaps Africa would inch toward the Arctic. Perhaps Antarctica, bathed in sunlight, would fracture into green archipelagos. The Pacific might deepen while the Atlantic narrows. Or maybe the crust, confused by imbalance, would stretch instead of compress. The continents could begin to drift apart faster, like the slow spreading of an ancient scar. It is strange to think of continents as travelers, but they are. Every fossilized mountain once stood somewhere else. Every stone beneath your feet has wandered across latitudes. The Himalayas were once an ocean floor. The Sahara was once lush with rivers. What we call here has always been somewhere else. When the planet leans, those old journeys resume in new directions. The energy that drives plate motion, heat from the planet's core, gravity tugging at density differences, the quiet churn of convection currents, would find new pathways. It's as if the entire Earth would sigh and shift its weight. And in that shift, fault lines might sing. Earthquakes, yes, but not just destruction. Movement, release. The planet adjusting to its own new posture. The continents, in their slowness, would be like tectonic dancers, hesitant at first, then graceful in their new rhythm. Deep below, the mantle would stir. Magma would move where it hasn't in ages. Old volcanoes could wake. New islands might rise through the ocean, steaming and raw, before cooling into lushness. In some places, the crust might thin, stretching into valleys wider than seas. In others, it might crumple, pressing stone into the sky. Imagine standing in that world millions of years after the tilt. The map unrecognizable. Familiar continents joined in new embraces or torn apart. The stars overhead the same, but the outline of the world beneath them utterly changed. There is a deep poetry in that, isn't there? That even the hardest things we know, the continents themselves, are not truly permanent. They are memories in motion. Slow, patient memories written in basalt and eroded by rain. And beneath that poetry, a quiet warning. When mass moves, the planet responds. Ice melting shifts weight from poles to ocean basins. Erosion carries mountains into rivers and rivers into seas. Each grain of sediment, each shifting ton of water, subtly alters Earth's spin, its rhythm, its spine. The balance changes and the crust adjusts. Always, gently, inevitably. We tend to think of the world as something we live on. But we live within it. We are part of the motion. Every mountain that crumbles feeds another that will rise. Every ocean floor consumed beneath a trench becomes the root of a future continent. Deep time doesn't rush. It only turns endlessly. And maybe, if the axis changed, if gravity found a new direction, the continents would begin to write a new chapter of their ancient story. A story not of destruction, but of rearrangement, of slow rebirth. Perhaps one day, long after we are gone, a new equator would cut across places we once knew. Jungles over former tundra. Volcanoes where plains once lay quiet. The Earth, still spinning, still evolving, would look utterly different, and yet still itself. Because drift is not chaos. It is continuity. The land always remembers where it came from, even when it moves on. And somewhere in that motion, in that soft rearranging of stone and time, another question forms, quiet, patient, inevitable. If the continents can wander and the world can tilt, then what of the oceans that cradle them? And more curiously still, what of the air above? Because when the planet leans, it is not only the land that shifts. The atmosphere, weightless and wide, begins to flow differently. Winds lose their familiar choreography. Storms forget where to gather. And sunlight, no longer shared in its usual rhythms, lingers in strange places and abandons others. In this tilted earth, heat forgets its old path. No longer centered along the equator as we know it, warmth pools where it shouldn't. In some places, the sun hovers for months. In others, it vanishes entirely. And so, the climate bands that once circled Earth like soft ribbons begin to loosen, unravel, twist. And deserts bloom in unlikely places. Not just where we expect dryness, but in places once lush, once drenched with monsoon or kissed by ocean breezes. Now, in this rearranged world, some of those green places bake under stillness. No clouds, no rain, only the hum of silence and the hush of dry wind. Imagine the equator as a belt of dust, stretching across old mountaintops and through the heart of continents once cradled by forest. Imagine heat pressing down not from above, but from a new angle, horizontal, insistent, relentless. Rain shadows lengthen. Rivers forget their routes. The soil begins to thin, then to vanish. And what remains is dust. Fine, pale, carried by air that no longer knows how to rest. It drifts across landscapes, coats the teeth of mountains. It sifts into valleys, softening everything with the quiet weight of erosion. Dust is the memory of stone, the residue of once great peaks, now humbled into particles too light to settle for long. It carries with it the history of climates, the echo of ancient ecosystems. And in this new world, where tilt has rewritten the script of warmth, dust becomes a signature, a symbol, constant. Oceans, too, begin to shift not just in volume but in place. Where once there were basins, now there may be salt plains. Where once waves gathered, now there may be silence. As heat and cold reorganize themselves, currents slow. Some stop entirely. Evaporation increases in some seas, draining them drop by drop. In others, rainfall surges unnaturally, drowning the land. The hydrologic balance tilts along with the axis. And with each drop that leaves or falls, another layer of the earth is etched away. Erosion accelerates, not because of violence but because of imbalance. Winds that blow too long from one direction, storms that linger too long over fragile ground. Sediment slides, sand shifts, and over time, the shapes of continents smooth, crumble, reshape. Deserts once fringed the subtropics, predictable and named, but now they stretch unpredictably, following new lines of light. Sahara merges with Amazon. Outback fuses with Himalayan foothills. Nothing is where it used to be, and yet this too becomes a pattern. A strange, unsettling symmetry built from heat and time. And within the dust, something else. Memory. Airborne archives of life and loss. Traces of pollen from vanished forests. Spores from extinct fungi. Microplastics from forgotten cities. Even traces of human breath, dried and suspended, moving slowly across oceans that no longer exist. Dust does not decay. It accumulates. Layer by layer, it blankets history. It buries roads. It silts into ruins. It softens the edges of extinction. And in that softness, it preserves. Perhaps one day, far from now, someone or something will study those layers the way we read sedimentary rock. A dusty chronicle of climate gone sideways. An atlas of tilt, told in the language of ash and erosion. But even now, we feel the weight of dust. We see it in the reddened skies at dusk, in the fine coat it leaves on windowsills, in the way it dims the stars just slightly, like time itself settling over everything. And as the planet turns under a new axis, it may be dust, not light, not water, that defines this chapter of Earth's memory. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is patient, because it moves without sound, and gathers without end, and writes quietly on the surface of everything. And if deserts bloom where jungles once stood, if dust becomes more common than rain, we are left to wonder, what else might rise from this new stillness? What new kind of silence might grow beneath the weight of wind? Maybe the kind that speaks in bones. If earth tilts, if oceans rise where valleys once lay, if deserts bloom where rain once carved rivers, then the past must shift with it. Fossils, once hidden beneath calm and sediment, may surface in unexpected places. Entire records of vanished lives, stirred by tectonic breath and exposed beneath strange new skies. Would we find coral fossils high in the Andes? Trilobites surfacing in Arctic permafrost? The skeletons of whales arched like bridges across dried-out sea basins? It's possible. It's already happened. Even now, in the world we know, we find ocean creatures halfway up mountains. The rocks of Everest contain the remains of ancient sea life, crushed and preserved by time and uplift. On every continent, fossils lie where they shouldn't, testaments to continents in motion and waters that once roamed freely across the planet's skin. Now imagine that happening faster. Not in human time, but fast in geological terms. A shift in tilt, a new balance of pressure and heat, and the land begins to rewrite its layers. The crust flexes, the seas wander, and buried bones stir. They do not wake, of course, but they emerge. Perhaps not as full skeletons, perfectly preserved, but as fragments. A tooth, a shell, a single vertebra from a species we've never known, a puzzle piece from an epoch we've forgotten how to name. And each of these relics would lie in a place that makes no immediate sense. A fossilized fern in the heart of a desert, the imprint of feathers beneath volcanic ash, a fish encased in limestone thousands of miles from the nearest shore. These are the bones of the tilted earth. They are not misplaced. We are. Because fossils are less about death and more about memory. The kind of memory the planet keeps when everything else is erased. When wind strips away soil, when cities fall quiet, when languages vanish, bones remain, pressed into layers, transformed by minerals, silent but not gone. And in this new world, this rebalanced, sun-shifted earth, those layers would not remain flat. They would twist and curl. Sediment would fold. Fossil beds would rise like breath exhaled through stone. Some would wash away before we ever saw them. Others would blink into view, revealed by retreating water or landslides or the slow, endless work of erosion. We might find new fossils in old places, or old fossils in new places. Either way, the record of extinction would grow more complex, because every extinction leaves behind a trace. And with each tilt, each shift in habitability, more species reach their end. Quietly, without ceremony, life gives way to stone. And yet, extinction is not only an ending, it is a transition. One form of memory replacing another. A living pattern becoming a fossilized one. The breath becomes bone, the bone becomes artifact, the artifact becomes a question. Who were you? When did you live? What world did you know? And maybe, just maybe, some of those voices would re-emerge through the sediment. Not in sound, but in shape. In the curve of a spine, the pattern of a tooth, the geometry of a wing that no longer flies. Somewhere deep beneath the surface of Greenland or buried under Saharan sand, an ancient species may be waiting to be seen again. Not because it returns, but because the land itself rotates enough to let it speak. And if we listen, we might hear a story we never expected. A story not just of death, but of placement, of survival etched in calcium, of moments long gone, held perfectly in a shell no larger than a fingernail. We may not understand all of it. We never do. But each fossil, each bone, is a sentence in Earth's quiet autobiography. And if the planet tilts, if it begins to shuffle its pages, we might find ourselves reading parts of the story out of order. And yet, in that strange, beautiful disorder, what if something long buried no longer wants to stay hidden? And what if, as it rises, something else slips quietly away, something we never knew we depended on. A sudden tilt could do more than move the land, could touch the heart of the planet. Deep below the crust, far beneath the fossil beds and shifting plates, Earth's core pulses. Not with sound, but with motion. Iron spinning within iron. A slow churning like breath made of metal. It is here, in this hidden sphere, that Earth's magnetic field is born. An invisible shield. A cloak. A kind of planetary whisper that keeps us safe. Without it, the sun would reach us more directly. Not just with light and heat, but with something quieter, stranger. Solar wind, cosmic rays, charged particles that dance against the edges of our atmosphere. Normally, they are caught by this shield, redirected, scattered. But if the axis shifted suddenly, the core might respond. Perhaps not instantly, but eventually, the spinning iron might slow, or swirl in new patterns. The magnetic field, so delicately balanced, might weaken, could fracture, could reverse. It has done so before, and if that field began to fade, we would not hear it. But we would feel it, not in thunder, not in storm, but in silence. Because the first thing to vanish might be the auroras. Those soft curtains of light that ripple near the poles, born from solar particles colliding with atmospheric gas, those would dim, then stop. Without the magnetic field to guide them, the sky would go quiet. No green waves, no electric shimmer, just darkness. The silence of the magnetic field is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of interaction. No song between sky and star, just distance. And in that stillness, our biology begins to listen. Because we are not separate from these fields. Our cells carry electric currents. Our hearts beat in rhythms that respond to solar cycles. Our sleep, our mood, our memory, subtle, fragile things, are shaped by invisible forces we barely understand. Some species navigate using Earth's magnetic lines. Birds, turtles, even bacteria, all tuned to an ancient frequency. If that frequency falters, migrations may fail. Eggs may hatch in the wrong places. Paths once instinctive may vanish. And for us, it may begin as restlessness. A quiet hum behind the eyes. Dreams that feel heavier. A sense of being untethered without knowing why. Scientists have recorded this before. During weak magnetic periods, cosmic radiation increases. Electrical systems behave strangely. Even historical accounts mention confusion, sleep disturbances, changes in mood during geomagnetic events. But this would be something deeper. Not a storm, a shift, a new arrangement of the planet's breath. And as we move through this altered field or lack of one, we may begin to notice other silences too. The kind that gather slowly, the kind that settle into our bones like cold. No auroras, no birds overhead, no migrations, no steady sense of direction, no certainty, just the quiet, trembling heartbeat of the planet, searching for balance. Could the magnetic field recover? Perhaps. It has done so before. It reverses every few 100,000 years, often taking thousands of years to do so. The poles wander. The shield flickers. Then it settles again. But what if this time is different? What if the tilt reshapes the flow of iron so deeply that the field fades for good? What then would we become? Maybe we'd adapt. Maybe not. Maybe life would evolve again beneath stronger skin. Or maybe it would move deeper, into caves, into oceans, into places the sun cannot touch. Or maybe the silence would become its own kind of rhythm. We forget how much of life exists because of invisible protection. Fields that hold back chaos. Systems we do not see. Forces we do not feel until they are gone. And if that magnetic silence deepens, if we forget the sound of auroras and the steadiness of planetary guidance, we may begin to wonder, what other fields have protected us, unseen? What other layers of memory exist? Not in fossils, not in bones, but in the invisible threads that hold the sky and soil together. And if those threads loosen, who might we become in their absence? Who might we become in the absence of invisible threads? Perhaps drifters like water searching for memory. Because if Earth tilts, if balance falters and the magnetic veil grows thin, then the oceans, our planet's vast lungs and quiet clocks, begin to forget their rhythm. And when oceans forget, everything begins to change. The equator, once the sun's favorite path, now bends toward unfamiliar angles. In this tilted world, heat pools not where it used to, but where gravity and light now meet in awkward conversation. The poles might flood with sunlight, while regions once scorched now lie beneath cool shadow. The earth doesn't burn all at once, it steeps, slowly, unevenly, a slow boil, not a rolling, furious heat, but something quieter, something insidious, warmth that arrives and does not leave, oceans that stop breathing the way they used to, because the sea breathes in motion. Currents carry heat like veins carry blood. From equator to pole, from surface to trench, the waters cycle. The Gulf Stream, the Kuroshio, the thermohaline conveyor. These are not names, they are memories. The planet's circulatory system, born from contrast. Warm meeting cold, salt meeting fresh, light meeting dark. But tilt those contrasts, and the pulse begins to slow. Warm water lingers at the surface, unable to sink. Cold water retreats into corners. The great conveyor belt of the ocean, sluggish even in the best of times, may halt. Without this motion, equatorial seas thicken with heat, stratify, go still. Stagnation is not silence. It is decay. Oxygen fades. Dead zones spread. Plankton falters, then vanishes. And the creatures that depend on it, tiny first then large, begin to starve. Fish no longer migrate because the signals are gone. Coral no longer pulses with life because the temperature never drops. Rainfall patterns spiral outward from confused oceans, making some coasts wetter, others dry forever. And then comes the question we barely dare to whisper. Could oceans boil? Not like a kettle, not violently, but gradually, systemically, because boiling in its essence is just the inability to release heat, the failure of a system to cool itself. If the atmosphere warms beyond a certain threshold, if clouds can no longer form, if currents no longer churn, then the surface may begin to rise in temperature with no easy way to stop it. It wouldn't begin with steam. It would begin with absence. Fewer fish, fewer birds, fewer clouds, the shimmer of heat above still water, the slow collapse of contrast. We've seen glimpses already, El Niño patterns lingering longer, polar melt diluting salt balance, marine heat waves lasting seasons. And these are under our current tilt. Under a new one, perhaps oceans would not boil fully, but they might retreat. Evaporation accelerating under relentless sun. Water pulled into atmosphere, into land, into places that cannot hold it. Sea levels rising and falling unevenly, not as a single tide, but as a scattered confusion, flooding one shore while abandoning another. Imagine the Pacific turning glassy and breathless, while the Indian Ocean swells into storm after storm. Imagine great gyres ceasing to spin, the quiet noise of a planet forgetting how to circulate. And in that forgetting, life bends. New species rise from stagnant waters. Extremophiles, filter feeders, strange jellies and bacteria that thrive in heat and depth. Creatures not designed for movement, but for patience. And what would we do? Would we build machines to stir the sea? Would we chase clouds with chemicals? Would we map the lost current patterns like ancient mariners studying broken stars? Or would we simply drift, waiting for the boil to cool? Because Earth, like all living systems, seeks equilibrium. Even in chaos, even when tilted, maybe it would find new pathways for heat. Maybe the oceans, in time, would forge new rhythms. Slower, stranger, but still alive. Maybe not. Maybe warmth would become the new silence. And if that silence stretches long enough, if the sea forgets what it once was, then the record of its old movements, its fossils, its flows, its memory, would fade into something else. Something geological. And that leaves us wondering, if the ocean forgets how to move, what happens to time itself? Perhaps it slows, or tangles, or sinks beneath the surface, leaving its weight behind. But time doesn't disappear. It settles, presses down, and eventually it becomes stone. Because stone remembers. Not quickly, not clearly, but deeply, quietly, in ways that unfold not in seconds or years, but in half-lives and crystallized echoes, in isotope trails, in compression patterns, in the way atoms organize themselves when no one is watching. If Earth tilted, if the axis leaned hard into another reality, could the stone tell us? The answer is almost always yes. If you know where to look. There are rhythms locked in rock that stretch longer than species, sedimentary layers that stack like breaths over millennia, bands of iron rusted by ancient oceans, zircons older than the moon's familiar pull, all of it waiting, all of it still. We call it the geological clock. But it does not tick. It settles. It decays. It aligns. Uranium turns slowly into lead. Potassium into argon. The ratios shift, molecule by molecule, in silence. And from that silence we read history. Tilt would not shout, but it would leave a mark. When light changes, minerals grow differently. When climates shift, erosion changes pace. When oceans stagnate or race across continents, the chemistry of deposition twists. Shells once laced with calcium now form with different elements. Soil darkens or bleaches. Layers thicken or vanish. And all of it, every slow collapse and quiet accumulation, leaves behind a fingerprint. Geologists read these stories not with words, but with microscopes, with mass spectrometers, with patient, tender work that asks, how old are you? What changed you? What were you before you became this? It's a kind of archaeology not of civilization but of entropy, because entropy carves time into stone, softens mountains into hills, hills into dust, dust into layers, and each layer tells a version of the truth. The tilt of the planet, the way it breathed, the way it turned, the way it held heat, can be seen in the angle of crossbedding, in the oxygen isotopes of fossilized shells, in the mineral pulses of ancient volcanic ash. Even cave formations hold clues. Stalactites growing at a slight slant, their rings bearing the signal of climate stretched and strange. Even the salt flats remember. Even ice, though not stone, becomes geological if you wait long enough. Its trapped bubbles whisper of air that once wrapped a different earth. And what's most humbling is this. The rocks do not lie. They are not myths. They are not allegory. They are memory without distortion. But they are also incomplete. Always. Tilted earths may have come and gone. And if the evidence was soft, was sediment, was soil, was coral, it may have been erased, subducted, melted, hidden in the deep belts where the crust turns back into heat. Still, enough remains. Fragments, suspicious gaps, ancient rock formations misaligned with their surroundings. Fossils found thousands of kilometers from where their ecosystem could have been. Magnetic striping in ocean crust that reverses suddenly, hinting at a field gone chaotic. These are not proof, perhaps, but they are possibility. And maybe that's enough. Because time carved in stone is not meant to be certain. It is meant to be considered, held, wondered at. Could the Andes have once been seabed? Yes. Could the Arctic have once known rainforests? It did. Could a continent have drifted across zones of heat and cold, tracing the arc of a forgotten tilt? The stones say yes softly. And if the stones remember the unimaginable, then what else might they be trying to say? Perhaps that change is not new. That the earth has reinvented itself more times than we can count. That every field, every plain, every shore is built atop what came before. Time doesn't erase, it layers, compresses, distills. And maybe one day someone will study the stones we leave behind. Not just buildings and statues, but technofossils. Traces of plastic, metal, soot. They'll ask, what tilted their world? What changed them? How fast did it come? And they'll listen to the stone. Because stone doesn't panic. It doesn't rush. It only endures. And that endurance, quiet, patient, slow, is how time holds itself together, even as the surface rearranges. So if the rocks remember the tilt, what does the sky remember? And more curiously, what do we remember of the sky? We used to read it like a book. Before clocks, before calendars, before language was written in ink, it was written in light. The arc of the sun, the pattern of stars, the way shadows moved across the ground like patient hands marking the hours. And so, we built our lives around the sky's rhythm. We planted when the days lengthened. We harvested when the shadows stretched. We aligned our monuments to solstices, our temples to equinoxes, our myths to the slow spinning of constellations. The sky was not a mystery, it was a memory. But tilt the earth, just once, just enough, and that memory would break. Where would our shadows fall, if the poles shifted? If the equator leaned and the sun traced new paths through unfamiliar skies? You might wake and see light pouring in from the north, even though you live in a place where morning was always eastward. You might stand at noon and cast a shadow that leans the wrong way. And over time, the disorientation would deepen, not just in your body but in your story. Because calendars are not tools, they're tales. The sun does not merely rise, it returns. It does not set, it descends into myth. The same stories echo from civilization to civilization. A god chasing the horizon, a serpent devouring light, a cycle of death and rebirth written into the stars. If the sky changes, do the stories change too? Some cultures might adapt. Others might lose their place. If a sacred mountain no longer catches the first light of spring, does its meaning fade? If a constellation disappears beneath the wrong horizon, does its myth unravel? The stars themselves remain, but how we see them does not. Ancient sky maps, carved into stone or painted onto cave walls, reflect a specific geometry, not just of stars, but of tilt, of angle, of celestial habits bound to axial lean. The constellations we know are not permanent, they are regional memories. And when Earth tilts, the regions move. Imagine Orion sinking into eternal daylight. Imagine the Southern Cross swinging high over Europe. Imagine Polaris drifting from its throne, no longer the North Star. Somewhere, a new star would take its place. A new calendar would begin. A new mythology would grow from the rearranged heavens. And yet, it would not feel new. It would feel like loss. The farmer whose crops no longer bloom at solstice. The elder who points to an empty sky and forgets why the story doesn't fit. The child who learns different stars than their ancestors and feels a difference they cannot name. We are not separate from the sky. We are timed by it. Even now, our circadian rhythms are tuned to subtle solar cues. Our mood shifts with day length. Our hormones respond to darkness and light. Civil time may be ruled by clocks, but biological time still belongs to the sun. And if that sun moves differently across the tilted earth, slower in some places, longer in others, skipping days or lingering too long, then time becomes a question. When is morning? When is winter? What does north mean if the compass no longer points to memory? Early civilizations built their survival around the answers to those questions. They measured time with gnomons, simple sticks that watched shadows change. They etched stone to mark the angle of sunrise. They aligned entire cities to stellar events. Now imagine them watching the skies tilt, watching sacred alignments dissolve, watching the heavens pull away from their stories. Would they understand it as science or as omen? Would we? Even now, astronomy reminds us how delicate orientation is, how the smallest wobble changes the sky. Milankovitch cycles, long, slow variations in Earth's orbit and tilt, are enough to usher in and end ice ages. A few degrees, a few thousand years, and all of climate, light, and memory begins to shift. So what if it all changed faster? Not violently, just quietly. A new angle, a new dawn, a calendar rewritten not by invention, but by necessity. And as shadows begin to fall in unfamiliar ways, we may once again look up, not for answers but for something older, for stories that still make sense when the world no longer does. And if our myths fade with the stars that inspired them, what else have we built on patterns that were never permanent? Perhaps the seasons themselves, spring, summer, autumn, winter, words that feel eternal, as if carved into the world like mountains or rivers. But what if they're not fixed? What if the rhythm we call seasonal is only a temporary music, played by a planet tilted just so? If Earth leaned differently, turned a little more sideways in the light, what would happen to that music? What storms might awaken? What breezes might never blow again? We like to think of weather as chaotic, but it isn't. It's patterned chaos, predictable in its unpredictability. A system of loops and flows, pressures and pulses, rooted in balance, between light and dark, hot and cold, ocean and sky. And if the balance shifts, the loops unravel. The trade winds, the jet streams, the monsoons, we know them because Earth has kept its tilt, more or less, for a very long time. They form because sunlight heats the equator more than the poles, because the planet spins at a certain speed, because land and sea alternate across latitudes in a familiar arrangement. But if those ingredients change, so does the recipe. Under a tilted Earth, the equator may no longer be the hottest place. The poles, bathed in long seasons of sunlight, may warm beyond recognition. The gentle gradient of temperature that drives air to move, to rise, to twist into storms, that gradient becomes strange. Some winds speed up, others vanish. The great engines of the atmosphere, the Hadley cells, the polar vortex, the rising thermals over warm ground no longer know where to go. They lurch, they stall, and with them the weather stutters. Some places drown in endless rain, others dry into silence. Hurricanes shift their breeding grounds. Thunderstorms bloom where snow used to fall. Lightning flashes in deserts. Snow curls across tropical hills. And in this new weather something else emerges. Echoes, not sounds, but patterns. Imprints of climates that no longer exist, resurfacing in warped forms. A thunderhead over tundra. A dust storm swallowing rainforest. Hail falling into steaming jungle. It's as if the atmosphere is haunted by old routines, trying to repeat them in a world that no longer fits. And then there is the silence, the absence of what we once expected. Winds that don't arrive, seasons that never quite begin. The soft grief of missing something you didn't know you could lose. The monsoon that pauses, the breeze that forgets, the snowfall that becomes myth. And with that silence comes confusion, not just in nature but in us. We are seasonal creatures. We build our lives around predictable change. School terms, harvest cycles, cultural festivals tied to solstice and equinox. Our hearts beat to an annual rhythm. But in a rebalanced world, that rhythm stumbles. Is it spring if nothing blooms? Is it summer if no rain comes? What does autumn mean when the trees no longer turn? Civilizations have collapsed before when the rains failed, when the rivers ran dry, when a decade of drought bent cities into dust. Now imagine that drought not as anomaly, but as the new normal. Not catastrophe, just change. Quiet, permanent change. And yet, deep beneath the panic, a truth remains. The climate machine never truly stops. It adapts, defines new balances. New circulations emerge. The atmosphere learns to dance again, but to a different tune. Will we? Maybe. But we'll have to listen differently. Not just for thunder, but for its absence. Not just for wind, but for where it doesn't go. Not just for rain, but for the rhythm in which it used to arrive. We'll need to learn the silence between the weather, the pauses, the missteps, the skipped beats, because in those gaps the future forms. A climate not worse, not better, but rearranged. And in that rearrangement we'll begin to write new meanings for old words. Not because we want to, but because the sky no longer speaks the same language. And if even the weather can forget its lines, what else might be waiting to melt from memory? Perhaps a memory itself, because not all history is written in stone. Some is frozen, paused, preserved in silence beneath layers of frost so old they've forgotten movement. The permafrost, ground that has remained frozen for tens of thousands of years, is not empty. It is full of life that no longer breathes, but still lingers. Beneath the Arctic and Antarctic, beneath tundra and boreal forest, beneath centuries of snowpack, lie time capsules of the unimaginable, moss sealed in ice, spores in a timeless sleep, fragments of extinct DNA, preserved by cold and darkness, bacteria that haven't stirred since before humans spoke in villages. Now, imagine that frost melting under a tropical sun. This is no longer imagination, really. Already, the Arctic warms 4 times faster than the global average. Already, the ice retreats. The ground thaws. What was held still begins to move. And with it, memory seeps into rivers. Not memory as thought, but as biology, as carbon, as genes, as trapped methane bubbles rising like forgotten breath, as ancient remains crumbling into streambeds that now run through landscapes they were never meant to know. What secrets are carried in that melt? The bones of mammoths, the teeth of ancient horses, soft tissue, fur, flesh, stomach contents, preserved with eerie precision. Seeds that can sprout after 20,000 years. Viruses encased in ice so long they predate the concept of civilization. We are not prepared for the kind of remembering that permafrost can do. Because ice is not just cold, it's patient. It holds the past without judgment. It doesn't erase. It waits. And now, with the poles thawing under a shifted sun, the past wakes up. Real science studies this wakefulness. Teams unearth woolly rhinos. They map genetic lineages from permafrost cores. They revive bacteria from frozen lakes and catalog RNA fragments from extinct ecosystems. Every new thaw brings another page of the Earth's forgotten autobiography. But the pages don't just tell us what was. They ask what might return. Could prehistoric microbes survive? Could ancient pathogens stir again, not out of vengeance, but because we unlocked their vault? Could ecosystems of the Pleistocene briefly bloom, like ghosts made of cells? And if they do, will we recognize them? Or will they recognize us? This is where speculation stirs gently into science. Where curiosity, not fear, leads the way. Not every microbe is a threat. Many are harmless. Some may even be beneficial. But their presence reminds us that the line between past and present is thin, and always melting. And not just microbes. DNA too emerges. Fragments of extinct animals. Unread scripts of evolution. What stories lie in a strand of hair? A broken tusk? A frozen drop of blood? Some scientists dream of de-extinction, reviving vanished species with genetic editing, recreating ecosystems that once thrived beneath now-thawing skies. Others see it as caution, a warning written in meltwater, a chance to study collapse before it repeats. Because the permafrost is more than biology. It is carbon. Gigatons of it, locked away in organic matter that never decayed because it never thawed. And as it softens, as it breathes again, it releases carbon dioxide, methane, greenhouse gases that heat the air, which melts the frost, which releases more gas, a feedback loop, a memory that feeds on itself, a gentle undoing. And all the while, rivers run faster, hillsides slump, trees tilt awkwardly in soil that can no longer hold their roots. The ground sighs, and buried things surface, not violently, not all at once, but steadily. And in that steady return, we see both gift and grief. The gift, insight, connection, knowledge of what once lived. The grief, knowing we may have melted something that never wished to return. Because not all memories are meant to wake. Some exist to remind us that the world is not linear, that the past is not gone, that even decay has a half-life, even stillness has a limit. And so, the next time the river rises brown with meltwater, carrying fragments of forgotten time, we might ask, what other stories does the earth remember, even when we don't? Perhaps the most surprising story is this, that even as memory fades, life begins again. Not as it was, not as we expect, but life, still. Because even in decay, something stirs. Even in imbalance, something adapts. Entropy, we're told, is the slow unwinding of order, the drift from structure into disarray. But sometimes, amid that disarray, roots take hold. Sometimes, in the quiet collapse of what was, something new learns to grow. So the question lingers, does Earth still grow life the same way, under a new tilt? Or does chaos find new roots? We picture life as orderly, cycles, seasons, predictable blooms, migratory paths drawn in invisible ink across generations. But these rhythms are all tuned to the tilt, the gentle lean of earth that once made time familiar. Now the tune has changed, and in this rearranged world, life must listen differently. Imagine a forest that never cools, a tree that flowers year-round because darkness never lasts long enough to signal dormancy, or a vine that climbs sideways, chasing a sun that arcs strangely across a skewed sky. Where seasons lose their edge, evolution finds new tools. Adaptation becomes wilder, faster, less bound by tradition. Some species fail to keep pace, their life cycles misaligned, their instincts betrayed by obsolete memory. But others, quietly, without warning, begin to shift. Insects breed to new rhythms. Birds adjust their migration not by calendar, but by light. Flowers bloom at odd angles, their petals facing unfamiliar dawns. Entire food webs unravel and braid themselves again into new configurations. And then, stranger things, feral adaptations. Flora with traits once considered rare, bioluminescence, heat resistance, spore-based reproduction, suddenly advantageous. Plants that were passive grow competitive. Roots that once reached down now spread wide, shallow, fast. Desert plants encroach on jungles. Aquatic moss finds footing on land. In the absence of old rules, evolution writes its own. And not just plants. Animals respond too. Fur changes texture. Ice shifts sensitivity. Behavior rewires, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. Sleep cycles stretch or shorten. New predators emerge, not through aggression, but through necessity. Even microbes, those ancient architects of adaptation, mutate faster, thrive in strange combinations, form new partnerships with hosts that didn't exist before. Lichen on bone, fungi in salt, symbiosis where competition once ruled. It's not always beautiful. Some things become grotesque, oversized, underdeveloped, pathways that lead nowhere. But even these missteps are part of the pattern. Life at its core is not tidy. It is relentless. Entropy does not kill life, scatters it, rearranges it. And in the scatter, the garden regrows, not as memory, but as invention. Perhaps in this tilted earth, the jungle returns to Antarctica. Not as it was, but as something new. Trees with thermal bark, shrubs that photosynthesize beneath snow. Or in deserts where ocean once stood, strange blossoms rise at night, petals soft with dew drawn from thin air. These are not dreams. They are possibilities. Already, extremophiles teach us that life bends further than we thought. Already, we find moss on glaciers, worms in boiling vents, bacteria in solid rock. Life has never been limited by our expectations. So why would it begin now? What's most humbling is not the strangeness of future life, but how natural it will seem once it arrives. We will not think twice about a plant that glows in twilight, or an animal that navigates magnetic fields because the stars no longer align. We will call it evolution, and it will be. But beneath that word lies something older: response. The earth shifts and life responds. And perhaps this is entropy's secret. Its garden is not chaos, but improvisation. Not the end of pattern, but the beginning of wilder ones. And when we walk through that garden, we may feel a kind of déjà vu, shapes that feel ancient, but are entirely new. Movements that echo something we once knew, but can't name. A strange familiarity in the curve of a leaf or the color of an eye. Because even as systems decay, echoes remain. And maybe that's enough. Maybe all life needs to grow again is an echo, a tilt, a pause, a broken rhythm, and the silence that follows. And if the garden can return under new skies, what else might find its way back? What, from extinction itself, might still remember how to live? And just as quietly, what might not? Because when the earth tilts, when climates twist and light falls differently, not all life follows. Some bend, some bloom, some endure, but others simply vanish. Not in spectacle, not with fire or flood or sound, but in silence, a slow fading, a mist season, a final seed that never finds soil. Extinction, after all, rarely arrives as thunder. More often it comes like dusk. We like to think of extinction as an event, a singular moment in time, but it's not. It's a process, a soft, unfolding retreat from the world. A species doesn't disappear in a breath. It slips. It loses ground. It survives in fewer places. It struggles to adapt. And then, somewhere in the sediment, it rests. When environments flip, when cold becomes heat, when dry replaces wet, those most adapted to certainty are often the first to go. The specialists, the ones who evolve to fit into very specific spaces. A flower that blooms only once per year, a fish that spawns only in a certain salinity, a bird that nests only when the sun rises at a certain angle. If the tilt rewrites those angles, those salinities, those spaces, so too does it rewrite survival. And yet, in that quiet rewriting we find traces. The fossil record is a book of absences, a shadow archive of all that once was, trillions of lives compacted into layers of rock and silt. Each extinction a comma, a pause, a breath in the long sentence of life. Some chapters are sudden, mass extinctions marked by iridium dust and shattered bones. But others are slow, imperceptible, a long exhale of biodiversity into a quieter, lonelier world. We know this because we've read the bones. Paleontology tells us what probability cannot, that survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about luck, about placement, about timing. The species that endure are not always the smartest, the fastest, or the most beautiful. Sometimes they are the overlooked, the generalists, the adaptable, the ones that can make do with less. Rodents, grasses, insects, algae. We often ignore them, but they are the scaffolding of ecosystems. And in times of tilt, times of imbalance, they often remain. But still, not all. In a world newly lit from the side, where seasons have no memory and rain falls out of place, even the adaptable feel the edge. The shadow of extinction grows longer, not as a threat, but as a presence. A quiet reminder that every species carries within it the shape of its own end. And yet, life continues. Even in loss, new species emerge. Niches left empty are slowly filled. Evolution does not mourn. It moves. It experiments. It forgets. But we remember, or at least we try. We walk with extinct species in museum halls and stone quarries. We hold their shapes in our hands, fossils, casts, old illustrations. We map their DNA. We model their ecosystems. We trace their decline, sometimes centuries after their last breath. And we wonder, if the world tilts again, if the rules change once more, who will follow them? Who will fall behind? We cannot know. Probability gives us patterns, but not answers. Paleontology gives us precedent, but not prediction. The tilt, if it comes, will write a future we cannot yet imagine. And within it, life will respond in ways we cannot yet measure. Some will thrive. Some will vanish. Some will transform beyond recognition. And perhaps that's the most honest shape of survival, not resisting change, but becoming something new within it. But extinction leaves a mark. Not just in rock or in data, but in silence. In the space a voice used to fill. In the absence of a sound, a color, a behavior that no longer exists. And sometimes, that silence lingers. A forest grows, but a bird never returns. A reef rebuilds, but a certain coral remains missing. A field thrives, but the pollinator is gone. Extinction is not just an ending. It is a missing piece, a blank that never quite fades. And so we walk carefully, quietly, through this new garden of earth, listening, observing, wondering, not just who will live, but who, if anyone, will remember who was lost. And if species can disappear without noise, what else might be leaving right now, just beyond our notice? And what, in time, will we leave behind? If the earth tilted sharply, if climate scrambled and oceans rearranged, if forests traded places with salt plains and deserts swallowed coastlines, If we, too, were swept into extinction, what would remain of us? What would the tilted Earth remember? Not the noise, not the language, not the light of our cities seen from orbit. Those would fade first. Light vanishes, data decays, screens go dark, roads crack, and glass becomes sand again. But stone remembers, and in stone we leave strange signatures. Some call them technofossils, not bones or shells, but artifacts of technology embedded in the future rock record. Plastics, concrete, alloys that do not occur in nature, traces of radiation, composites of glass and metal and ash, fused together by industry and time. We are not the first species to change the climate, but we may be the first to leave behind synthetic sediment. Now imagine those traces scattered across a world no longer aligned. Imagine a plastic bottle embedded in a cliffside that used to be a beach. A microchip compressed in ice now exposed under a tropical sun. A city, once coastal, now a fossilized reef of steel, surrounded by wind-blown dust. It wouldn't take long. Within a few centuries of human absence, vegetation reclaims buildings. Roots buckle concrete. Insects move in. Fire, flood, and entropy do their work. But beneath all that, under layers of decay, some things stay. Polymer that doesn't break down. A brick from a nuclear test site. A synthetic dye absorbed into soil so thoroughly that it tints the very memory of the landscape. And long after we're gone, these things remain, not as monuments but as questions. Who made this? What purpose did it serve? Why is it here, buried in this layer of chaos? We think of fossils as ancient, but time moves differently in geology. 1,000 years is a whisper, 1,000,000, a breath. If the Earth tilts, reorders itself, and life goes on without us, future beings, whether evolved here or arriving from elsewhere, may one day stumble upon the detritus of our ambition. And what would they think? Would they mistake a landfill for a natural formation? Would they read circuitry as bone? Would they understand that a crushed smartphone once carried memories, photographs, maps of a world that no longer exists? Or would they, like us, dig with wonder and uncertainty? Even now, we find things we don't understand. Tools embedded in sediment older than expected. Geometries in rock that suggest pattern, but no clear maker. Are they ours? Are they natural? Are they something else? Perhaps, in the deep future, our own fossils will inspire similar questions. Not because we were mysterious, but because we, too, become misplaced in time. Technofossils, in this sense, are a kind of reverse extinction. They're not the memory of what once lived, but the echo of what once acted, what shaped, what transformed the world. We may vanish, but our impact may linger, stratified in geology, recontextualized by climate, misunderstood by whatever comes next. And it's strange, isn't it, that our most enduring legacy may not be art or language or love, but trash. A plastic doll buried beside a fossilized pine cone. A tire tread pressed into stone beside the track of a vanished elk. Technological sediment scattered across the Earth's surface like fingerprints left in a dream. And if the planet tilts, those fingerprints spread further. They move inland. They rise. They fall. They migrate into mountains, into seabeds, into layers we never meant to touch. Our leftovers drifting without intention, fossilized out of context. And that may be the final humility, that in the eyes of deep time we are not special, just curious, just temporary, just another pattern etched into the crust, destined to be discovered, puzzled over, perhaps even ignored, but still remembered, not by name, not by story, but by placement, by residue, by the wrong thing in the wrong place. And if that is how the Earth holds us, what might that say about those who came before us? Maybe they, too, disappeared quietly, buried not in fire, but in pressure, not erased but folded, pressed into stone by forces too large to name. Because beneath everything we see, something deeper always moves, not in haste, not in anger, but with slow, unrelenting strain. The crust, the Earth's thin skin, is never still. creaks, it stretches, it resists, but eventually it yields. And when the axis of the Earth begins to tilt, when gravity shifts just slightly, and the sun touches new ground, the crust feels it first. Not all at once, but deeply. Tectonic plates, those vast, slow-moving slabs of lithosphere, are sensitive to balance. They rest upon the mantle like rafts on a viscous tide, driven by currents of molten rock far below. When that balance changes, when mass redistributes from melting poles, when oceans slosh into new basins, when pressure maps are redrawn by tilt, the plates respond. Stress accumulates, quietly, incrementally, until it doesn't. And then the crust speaks, not in language, but in rupture. Earthquakes are not chaos. They are release. They are the sound of the planet adjusting to its own discomfort. A kind of internal breathing, sharp, irregular, but necessary. So what would earthquakes sound like? When the axis is reborn, they might come more often in places we didn't expect. They might tremble through old fault lines reawakened by weight and time, or split new ones open, jagged and raw. We might feel them beneath ancient cities built before anyone dreamed the ground could rise. But many would go unnoticed. Deep quakes, silent quakes, slow slip events that unfold over days or weeks, moving entire continents a few millimeters without anyone knowing. Not every crack is loud. Some are patient. Some wait lifetimes to finish a thought. And when they do, mountains shift. Valleys widen. Rivers take new paths. The earth rearranges itself, not violently, but deliberately. Tilted Earth is not only a vision of strange skies and changing seas. It is a world where the skeleton of the planet groans under a new geometry. Fault lines strain not just with pressure, but with memory. With the long fatigue of holding shape for too long. The crust remembers its weaknesses. It remembers where it broke before. The San Andreas, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the East African Rift, each a scar, each a song still playing beneath our feet. If the planet's posture shifts, these songs may grow louder, or vanish into silence, replaced by new harmonies of tension. And with cracks come fire. Where the crust yields, the mantle rises. Magma finds space. Volcanic systems awaken, not because of fury, but because heat must move. Pressure must rise. Gases must escape. We think of eruptions as sudden, but many begin with murmurs. A distant quake, a swelling hillside, a puff of sulfur where none should be. The signs are soft at first, but the planet has time. Speculative eruptions in a tilted Earth wouldn't necessarily be larger, just differently placed. Volcanoes where there were none. Entire chains born in the gaps between shifting plates. Underwater ridges that blossom into islands. Dormant peaks that exhale again, their timelines reset by the geometry of tilt. Imagine a ring of fire redrawn across a new equator. Imagine ash drifting across skies unfamiliar with its taste. Imagine soil, decades later, made rich by lava that once broke through confusion. Because even in rupture, there is renewal. Cracks in the crust let the earth breathe. Let its core speak. Let its deep heat feed the surface once more. Without them, the planet would suffocate in stillness. And perhaps so would we. Maybe that's the strange gift of earthquakes, of eruptions, of broken fault lines and crusts pushed beyond their comfort. They remind us that stillness is not always safe, that balance is not always quiet, that the ground we walk on is not passive, it is responsive. And when the axis tilts, when gravity shifts, the crust does not break out of punishment. It simply adjusts. Like all things under strain, it finds a way to continue, to bend, to open, to release the pressure that might otherwise destroy it. And in that slow, rumbling dance of destruction and renewal, we are offered a question. If even stone must break to remain whole, what might we need to let go of in order to stay? If even stone must break to remain whole, what does the water do? It flows, of course. It always has. But not randomly. The ocean moves with purpose. Not in straight lines, but in loops, spirals, and layers, currents that curve across the globe like soft calligraphy written in temperature and salt. These are the ocean's memories. Each current is a story of contrast, of warm rising and cold sinking, of fresh water dancing with dense brine, of wind pulling surface currents across invisible ridges of pressure. Together, they form a quiet, looping system we call the thermohaline circulation, a conveyor belt of heat and salt, the ocean's long breath. But in a tilted world, the breath stutters. Tilt the planet and the sunlight shifts. Ice melts in strange places. Rain falls where it never used to. Evaporation quickens. Rivers reroute. And with each change, the balance of salt and temperature begins to unravel. The ocean forgets where to go. The Gulf Stream weakens, or swells, or wanders. The deepwater formation off Greenland, once the heartbeat of sinking cold, slows or stops. The Indian Ocean pulses out of sync. Southern currents loop northward too soon or too late. Patterns dissolve like ink in warm water. What does that do to the world? First, the heat lingers. Without currents to carry warmth from the equator to the poles, the tropics grow hotter. The polar regions, if tilted toward the sun, may overheat, then stall. Deserts expand. Monsoons misfire. Coastlines flood not just from rising seas, but from storms fueled by strange heat. And beneath the surface, something quieter happens. The deep sea stills. Much of the ocean's life begins with motion. Nutrients from below rise with upwelling currents. Cold water from the abyss touches the surface and feeds plankton, which feeds everything else. But without circulation, the layers settle. Stratify. The surface gleams with warmth. The depths darken, barren. It becomes harder for oxygen to sink, harder for carbon to rise. The ocean's lungs collapse inward, breath held for too long. And in this stillness, life begins to forget its cues. Spawning seasons slip out of sync. Algae blooms where it shouldn't. Migration routes dissolve. Coral bleaches not only from heat, but from confusion. The logic that guided the ocean's oldest inhabitants begins to blur. And still the water moves, but without memory. In this reoriented world, the oceans do not stop. They reinvent. New currents emerge, slowly, unpredictably, based on new distributions of heat, land, salinity, and wind. Perhaps they are shallower, or slower. Perhaps they spiral in directions we cannot yet imagine. But even these new patterns take time, centuries, maybe longer, to establish. Until then, the ocean wanders, and we drift with it. Already we see the signals. Cold pools where they don't belong. Anomalies in salinity. The slow weakening of Atlantic currents. Warming eddies where once there was chill. And yet these are only preludes. A rehearsal of what could come if Earth leans too far. But there's another kind of memory deeper still. The ocean keeps its own archive. In its sediments. In its chemistry. In the isotopes layered like rings at the bottom of the sea. Oxygen ratios that trace ancient ice ages. Foraminifera shells whispering of climates long gone. Layers of plankton bloom and volcanic ash and dust from forgotten droughts. And buried beneath all that, deep beneath the silence, we find clues that the ocean has changed before. That currents have stopped, restarted, reversed. That anoxic events, when the deep sea loses all oxygen, have come and gone like long exhalations. So perhaps the ocean does not forget. Perhaps it simply waits. For balance. For contrast. For the soft return of the conditions that let it breathe. And until then it holds its stories close. It swirls them in eddies. Locks them in salinity. Hides them in trenches deeper than mountains are tall. Waiting, as Earth reshuffles its axis, for the time to speak again. Because when water flows with memory, it nourishes. But when it flows without memory, what kind of world will it carry forward? And who will we be in it? Imagine waking up and the light hasn't changed. Hours pass, and still the same soft glow stretches across rooftops. Never slanting, never deepening, never dimming. Shadows hover but never shift. The day does not age. The sun remains, quiet, heavy, constant. Anchored high in the sky like a thought that won't dissolve. This is what a tilted Earth might bring. A sun that no longer rises and falls in familiar rhythm, but hangs motionless over entire regions. Not for hours, but for weeks, or longer. And the question is simple but unsettling. Would we adapt or unravel? Because we are, all of us, creatures of cycles. Our minds are tuned not just to time, but to change. To the contrast between light and dark, movement and rest, wakefulness and sleep. It's not just habit, it's biology. Our circadian rhythm, that ancient internal clock, runs on light. And when light stops moving, the clock falters. Already, we know what happens in the far north, or deep in polar research stations, when the sun vanishes or refuses to set. Sleep becomes fragmented. Dreams become vivid or vanish entirely. Appetite drifts. Emotion flattens or spikes. The line between waking and sleeping thins. Now imagine that not at the edge of the world, but at its center. Imagine cities where streetlights are never needed, where buildings cast the same shadow every hour, where people begin to wonder if it's morning or night, not based on light, but on guesswork, on screens, on social constructs that lose their grip. Clocks might still tick, but without the sun's movement, time becomes something artificial, something agreed upon rather than felt. And over time, that agreement phrase. Some people might thrive, the insomniacs, the hyper-focused, the dreamers, but many would not. Mood disorders could rise, memory might slip, children might forget the meaning of bedtime, elders might feel adrift. Productivity would change, not from laziness, but from temporal disorientation. And in that disorientation, something stranger might grow. New cultures of sleep, social norms that accept wakefulness at any hour, cities lit from within rather than above, entire communities shifting from a single shared rhythm to multiple private ones, time as a personal landscape rather than a communal map. And it wouldn't just be the light, it would be the lack of darkness. Darkness matters. It's not just for rest, it's for repair, for recalibration. In darkness, the brain releases melatonin, the body resets, the mind dreams. Take that away even gently, and the architecture of thought begins to warp. Some may chase artificial darkness, light-blocking curtains, blue filters, simulated sunsets on LED walls. We try to imitate the lost contrast, but we'd know somewhere that it wasn't quite real. And others might forget the need for night altogether. In the absence of darkness, would our myths change? Would we forget the shape of constellations? Would stories of moonlight and starlight become folklore, artifacts of a time when the heavens once turned? Even language might shift. Good morning becomes meaningless. See you tonight no longer signals rest. Time markers blur into habit, and habit untethers from biology. And yet, some would find beauty in it, in endless golden hour, in never watching the light fade, in building cities bathed in perpetual sun, their glass glowing softly, their plants photosynthesizing without pause. Architecture might shift, no longer braced against night, but designed to filter excess. Homes that simulate dusk, buildings that bend light, that shade entire neighborhoods into sleep. But beneath it all, a question lingers. If the sun no longer leaves, does time still pass? Or do we begin to live in stillness? A kind of temporal mirage where change continues but feels less real. We might learn to cope. We might not. And in those places caught beneath the sun that never sets, something ancient inside us might whisper for darkness. Not out of fear, but out of need. Not just for sleep, but for ending. For pause, for mystery. And if we lose the contrast between day and night, what else might we forget how to see? Maybe color. Not the color of light, but of life. The vivid hues that once shimmered beneath the ocean's surface. Corals in bloom, fish in flickers, whole reefs alive with movement and memory. Now imagine those colors fading. Not in a flash, but in a sigh. Slowly, quietly. Pale branches where once there was fire. Silence where once there was rhythm. Because when the oceans lose their way, the coral are the first to show it. They don't scream. They bleach. And bleaching isn't death, not at first. It's a reaching, a warning. Coral expel their symbiotic algae, their source of color and nourishment, when the water warms too much or too fast. It's a kind of protest, a last-ditch adaptation. But if the stress remains, the color does not return. And in a tilted world, where ocean currents stall, where temperatures linger in the wrong places, where the chemistry of water bends out of balance, those stresses grow. The reefs suffer first, then the fish, then the balance. Because coral are not decoration. They are structure, architecture. They are the cities of the sea, built not from stone, but from bone, calcium carbonate skeletons layered over centuries. Reefs protect coastlines, feed species, capture carbon. They are the lungs and libraries of shallow seas. But when the water warms, and the acid creeps in, the skeletons begin to dissolve. This is ocean acidification. As more carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere, more of it is absorbed by the ocean. It reacts with water to form carbonic acid. The pH drops. The sea becomes just slightly more acidic. But even that small shift weakens the building blocks of coral, shellfish, plankton. Calcium carbonate, the very material that forms coral bones, becomes harder to hold together, harder to grow, easier to break. And so, one by one, the quiet architects of the ocean fall. Reefs crumble, shells thin. Plankton, the tiny drifters that form the base of the marine food chain, reproduce less or not at all. And the breath of the sea becomes shallow, because Earth breathes in carbon. It cycles, from volcano to sky, from tree to ocean, from stone to shell. Coral reefs, forests, soils, and plankton, each plays a role in holding and moving this element. A long exhale followed by a longer inhale. But when one part falters, the rhythm stumbles. And in a world already shifting its axis, with sunlight falling in new patterns, with heat trapped in strange places, with ocean currents meandering off course, the carbon cycle wobbles. Not a collapse exactly, but a loss of coordination. Like an orchestra where the instruments keep playing, but the tempo is lost. We see it in the sediment. Layers of limestone, once made of coral and plankton, thin and vanish. Carbon isotopes shift. The fossil record grows uneven. Some periods show lush life, carbon-rich and vibrant. Others show gaps, quiet spells, epochs when carbon was trapped or released in ways we still don't fully understand. Coral fossils, in particular, tell us when the oceans were well or when they were in retreat. A healthy reef leaves behind layer after layer of calcium memory. A dying one leaves little. In the deep future, what would they find? A sharp line in the rock where coral ends. A dark layer of acid-altered shells. A spike in carbon. A fall in biodiversity. A breath held too long. And yet, Earth survives. It has always found new rhythms after collapse. It reconfigures. It learns to breathe differently. New chemistries, new balances. Life shifts, adapts, continues. But something is always lost. Not just species, but relationships, roles. The quiet collaborations between coral and algae, between fish and reef, between ocean and sky. And in that loss, the question rises: how many collapses must a planet endure before it forgets how it once was? And what are we in the middle of that memory? Witnesses? Causes? Fossils in the making? The sea is not angry. It is not kind. It only reflects. It only responds. It only holds what we give it. And as we tilt further, as the oceans swell and sigh and dissolve the bones of their builders, we may begin to wonder, if coral can vanish without sound, what else is unraveling just beneath the surface? Perhaps not something new, perhaps something old, something ancient enough to have already happened, long before we knew how to look. We often speak of Earth's future as if it waits ahead of us, unknown and untouched. But what if parts of that future are simply repetitions, echoes, tilts and turns the planet has already known, recorded not in numbers, but in the placement of stones, the turning of stars, and the myths we call stories? Could a great tilt have already happened? Not within the span of modern science, but before writing, before calendars, before we drew meaning from the sky with equations instead of awe? Could our ancestors have witnessed a shifting world and folded that memory into symbols? We begin with what we cannot explain. Structures aligned to stars that no longer rise where they once did. Stone circles, temples, pyramids, all aimed with precise intention. Aligned to solstices, equinoxes, heliacal risings. But when we run the numbers, something feels off. A few degrees, a missed alignment, a shadow that falls in the wrong place now, though it once fell perfectly. Precession, we say, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over 26,000 years. It explains the drift of stars in the sky. But sometimes the change feels sharper, compressed, like something more than precession, like memory slipping too fast to be explained by wobble alone. We find sky maps painted on cave walls, animals beside constellations, serpents twisting across stone like the Milky Way bending through time. And we wonder, were they only myths or observations? Was the sky they saw the same one we know, or something else? What if the world once tilted, abruptly, unevenly, and the sky rearranged itself in a single lifetime? To us, it would be unthinkable. But to those early watchers, the sky was not theory. It was memory. The stars were the first storytellers. If their positions changed, so did reality. And so stories were born, of gods who fell from the heavens, of suns that refused to set, of days that stretched too long, of nights that swallowed seasons, of floods, fire, and forgotten calendars. We tend to read those myths as metaphor. But what if some of them are maps? In speculative archaeology, we trace patterns between cultures that should have never met. Similar symbols, similar celestial logic, a serpent in the sky, a tilted tree connecting heaven and earth, a deluge that arrives when constellations misalign. Coincidence, perhaps, or convergence, but maybe residue of a previous tilt. And if such a tilt occurred, sudden or slow, it would not only change the stars. It would change where rivers flowed, where storms gathered, where crops could grow. Civilizations might shift, not because of war or politics, but because the light changed. And when the light changes, everything else follows. In ancient soils, we find abrupt climate anomalies, layers of dust and drought, glacial retreats with no clear cause, a spike in carbon, a shift in pollen, as if Earth skipped a beat and life scrambled to catch up. We call them mysteries, but perhaps they are signatures, scars left by a planet that leaned too far, then slowly remembered how to stand. And maybe the memory remains in the ruins, in staircases that no longer point to solstice, in sunken temples built for stars that no longer visit, in legends that speak of celestial war, of tilted worlds, of skyborne correction. These are not facts, not yet, but they are questions too large to ignore. Because if a tilt happened once before, it can happen again. And maybe we've forgotten what it looks like. Maybe the myths were warnings softened by time. Maybe the alignments were anchors. Maybe the stories were stitched into the stones not to explain the world, but to remember how it moved. And if the earth is tilting now, again, slowly beneath our feet, then perhaps we're living not in a beginning but a return. A re-entry into a cycle so wide we mistake it for myth. So we listen, not just to satellites and seismic sensors, but to silence, to stone, to sky, to story, because history is not always straight. Sometimes it tilts. And in that long lean between memory and imagination, what else might the planet be trying to remind us? Maybe this, that even in disorder something chooses to grow. Tilt the earth and the balance falters. Climates shift. Cycles unravel. What once seemed steady begins to scatter. But scattered doesn't mean still. Unbalanced doesn't mean empty. Even chaos carries potential. In a tilted world, order fights harder to exist. It must work against the grain of randomness. It must gather itself from fragments, not structure. And yet life does. That's the wonder. That amid entropy, the universal drift from complexity to simplicity, from structure to dissolution, life continues to rise. Not as dominance, not as conquest, but as resistance. Gentle, persistent resistance. A tree growing through broken pavement. A spiral shell forming in acidifying seas. A sleeping animal adjusting to light that no longer dims. These aren't accidents. They're declarations. Even now, entropy surrounds us. Every system decays. Heat dissipates. Information fades. Mountains wear down. Stars burn out. The second law of thermodynamics is not a threat. It is a law of forgetting. Everything tends toward disorder. But life is the exception that keeps happening. Every cell, every strand of DNA, every behavior and adaptation is an arrangement, a momentary pause in the unraveling. Life takes entropy and shapes something from it, however briefly. A leaf, a heartbeat, a memory. On a tilted earth, where patterns no longer align, this defiance becomes even more astonishing. Evolution doesn't stop when balance breaks. It becomes more creative, more adaptive. Life doesn't require stability, it requires opportunity. And opportunity still exists, even in a world spinning sideways. Physics tells us that order is costly, that energy must be spent to create coherence. But biology does this every moment. Cells spend energy to maintain walls. Organisms burn calories to keep warm, to grow, to reproduce. Ecosystems exchange nutrients, photons, signals, all fragile, all temporary. And yet they persist. Not forever, but long enough to matter. Maybe that's all defiance is, not rebellion, not victory, but persistence. Long enough for a seed to take root, for a species to adapt, for thought to rise from neurons and name the stars. Entropy is not the enemy. It is the backdrop, the silence against which the song of life becomes audible. And Earth is the cradle of that song. Not in spite of entropy, but within it. A planet always shifting, always aging, always tilting. Yet still alive, still full of systems that self-correct. Still full of forms that emerge from nothing but sunlight and minerals and time. Even under a new axis. Even when gravity feels strange and the sky seems misaligned. Even when oceans no longer remember how to circulate. When climates no longer rhyme with season. When deserts trade places with meadows and night refuses to fall. Still, something will grow. A moss on cooling stone. A microbe in a vent. A thought in the mind of someone looking up, wondering why the stars seem different than they did before. And perhaps this is hope, not the guarantee of survival, but the continuation of response. The belief or the observation that life continues to answer the call of disorder by organizing itself once more. Not perfectly, not predictably, but beautifully, in the folds of leaves that catch unfamiliar light, in the pigments of creatures adjusting to a new spectrum of sky, in the delicate architecture of a coral reef rebuilt from rubble. And in us, too, in the stories we tell to make sense of things that don't align, in the ways we adapt our homes, our rhythms, our cultures to an earth that won't hold still, in the dreams we carry even when the sun no longer rises the way it used to. We are not immune to entropy, but we are shaped by it, sharpened by it. We are the result of billions of years of temporary order, each life a pause, each thought a structure, each moment a breath of coherence in a universe always exhaling. So when the tilt comes, if it comes, let us not fear the unraveling. Let us listen for what grows in its wake. And in the quiet that follows change, what other forms of defiance might still rise to meet the dark? Perhaps ice, not as stillness, not as silence, but as movement in reverse, a kind of cold recursion, a memory expanding, not fading. Because if the planet tilts, if sunlight drapes unevenly across hemispheres and seasons slip from their anchors, ice may not just melt, it may return, and not to the poles where we expect it, but to stranger places, to the middle, to the edge of the tropics, to lowlands where flowers once bloomed, to cities carved from warmth, ice growing backward, and the question rises like breath in cold air. If glaciers began to move toward the equator, what time would we be living in? Past or future? Feels like a paradox. Ice, we're told, is the past, the remnant of a colder Earth. the mark of an age before warmth took hold. But that's not quite true. Ice doesn't belong only to the past. It's part of a rhythm, long, slow, orbital. Milankovitch cycles. Subtle variations in Earth's orbit, its axial tilt, its wobble, each shaping how sunlight falls across the planet. These cycles stretch over tens of thousands of years. And with them, the ice responds. It grows. It retreats. It forgets. It remembers. An ice age is not a moment, but a pattern, a recurring breath of the planet. We live now in what's called an interglacial, one of the brief warm pauses between long expanses of cold. But if the Earth's tilt shifted more dramatically than the cycles predict, that breath might stutter, or reverse, and the glaciers might move in again, not from the top of the world, but from the edge of memory. Already, the planet carries the scars of these icy migrations. Grooves etched into bedrock, U-shaped valleys, boulders stranded far from their origin, carried on the backs of frozen giants. These are the fingerprints of glaciers, slow, vast, unyielding. And deep in the geologic record we see stranger things. Equatorial glaciation, ice reaching nearly to the planet's waist. A world so frozen we've named it Snowball Earth. A time when ice may have covered oceans, continents, even the tropics. That was over 600 million years ago. But what if it happened again? A sudden tilt could do more than confuse weather. Could shift the balance of energy across the globe. Sunlight might strike the poles too directly while skipping over mid-latitudes. Or vice versa. Feedback loops, ice reflecting light, cold deepening cold, could cascade. And slowly, the glaciers would begin to crawl in the wrong direction. Backward, we'd call it. But to the Earth, direction is irrelevant. It only knows balance. And when balance breaks, ice fills the void. Not quickly. Not in our lifetime, perhaps. But steadily. Snow that doesn't melt. Ground that freezes deeper each year. Permafrost spreading instead of shrinking. Glacial tongues reaching out, year after year. Consuming forests, plains, memories. And with that cold comes silence. Species retreat. Soil sleeps. Rivers slow beneath thickened skin. The color fades. Life adapts somewhere else. And yet, in the ice there is memory. Tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped for millennia. Fossilized pollen. Dust from long-vanished deserts. Even fragments of DNA, frozen and preserved in crystalline stillness. Each glacier becomes an archive, sliding gently over the land, pressing the past into shape. If we lived through such a time, we might feel it as regression, as loss. But Earth would feel it differently. To the planet, the return of ice is not failure, it's rhythm. It's the continuation of a pattern we are too brief to see. And so we ask, would that world be a glimpse of the past? Or a passage to the future? Maybe both. Time doesn't always move forward in straight lines. Sometimes it folds. Sometimes it loops. Sometimes the cold comes not to erase but to reset. And in the quiet center of the glacier, deep beneath layers of compressed snow, beneath the weight of time itself, we might find the answer frozen in place. Or we might find nothing at all. Just a long, slow breath of the earth. Exhaling warmth. Inhaling stillness. And if the ice grows backward, what else might we misunderstand about the direction we're heading? Perhaps everything. Because we assume the surface tells the whole story. The winds, the waves, the forests, the fossils. The tilt of the earth, the shift of seasons, the quaking of crust. But what if the real memory, the deep, enduring record of what has been, is buried far beneath? Deeper than the ice. Deeper than stone. Deeper than the bones of species long gone. What if the mantle remembers? The mantle is not rock the way we know it. It is solid, but it flows. Slow as glass. Dense. Pressured. Alive with heat that has never seen the light of sky. It stretches from just beneath the crust to just above the core, nearly 3,000 kilometers deep. A hidden ocean of stone, shifting over eons, pulsing softly with the planet's breath. We don't see it, but we feel it. Every earthquake begins here. Every volcanic exhale. Every mountain's birth. Every rearrangement of the continents begins in the slow churn of this subterranean sea. And within that churn, there may be memory. Not memory as we hold it, not images or words, but patterns. Residue. Strain etched into minerals. Heat signatures layered over time. Waves of motion from ancient impacts. Ancient tilts, still rippling silently through density. Seismic memory. When the earth shakes, the energy moves through its body like sound through flesh. These waves bend and reflect and refract depending on what they pass through. And we listen. With seismographs and algorithms and patient ears, we listen to how the earth talks to itself. Some waves move quickly. Others linger, slowed by strange zones in the mantle, area scientists call low-velocity zones, or ultra-low velocity anomalies. They are not well understood. They may be hotter, softer, pockets of primordial rock. They may be scars from when the earth first cooled, or messages, clues. Some researchers speculate that these anomalies may record ancient events. Asteroid strikes, superplumes, even planetary reorientations. Not directly, but as disruptions, as echoes. Could the mantle remember the last time the axis shifted? If such a shift applied pressure unevenly, melting one region, compressing another, stirring convection currents, then perhaps the shape of that memory is still deep below us. Not visible, but present, like a dream the Earth hasn't finished having. And if the planet tilts again, perhaps those zones will stir, respond, realign the way muscles remember a movement they haven't made in years. Because memory at its core is repetition, and the Earth is full of cycles. Some known, some guessed, some too slow for us to name. We talk about Earth's crust, its tectonic plates, but the crust is less than one of the planet's volume. It is the skin, the breath, the passing moment. The mantle is the mind. And if the mind remembers more than we think, then maybe the planet is not just reacting, it is recalling. Recalling the last time the glaciers reached the tropics. Recalling the last reversal of magnetic fields. Recalling a great tilt that rewrote its balance, and waiting subtly, invisibly, for it to happen again. It's hard to imagine stone holding memory. But then again, we are made of stone. The calcium in our bones. The iron in our blood. The silicon in our tools. We are walking minerals softened by life. And if we can remember, maybe the planet can too. Not with awareness, but with structure. With changes in heat. With the way certain waves refuse to move straight. With the way the deepest layers still tremble from something they can't quite release. The mantle is not silent. It hums, pushes. It gives rise to all that we stand on. And it may know things we've yet to discover. Things we've yet to even imagine. Things that could explain why the planet turns the way it does, and what waits when the turning slows, stops, or shifts again. So we listen, not for words, but for rhythm, because beneath our feet, far beneath, a memory stirs. And if the mantle remembers the last time Earth tilted, what might it already know about the next? Perhaps it is not alone. Earth is not the only world that turns, not the only one that leans or stumbles or forgets the path it once took. In the quiet reaches of our solar system, other planets move through their own strange balances. Some steady, some broken. Some, like Earth, remember gently. Others have tilted far beyond recognition. And so we look outward, not for answers but for sympathy, for a reflection, for a soft comparison that helps us understand what might happen here, because it has already happened elsewhere. Mars, for instance, has no large moon to steady its spin. And without that anchor, its axis wobbles wildly. Over millions of years, it sways from a tilt similar to Earth's, to extremes of 60 degrees or more. As polar ice caps migrate, as climate shifts, what once was frozen thaws. What once was temperate disappears beneath cold. There are dry riverbeds carved into Martian valleys, delta fans, ancient lakebeds, craters etched with the signature of erosion, all pointing toward a time when Mars may have had warmth, movement, water, maybe even something like weather, but its memory fractured, its rhythm broke, Perhaps from a tilt too far, too fast. Perhaps from the loss of internal motion. Perhaps from time itself, carving silence where there once was flow. And then there's Venus, close to Earth in size, in gravity, in potential. But its rotation is almost frozen. It spins backward, slowly, taking longer to complete a day than to orbit the sun. Its axis tilt is minimal, not because it has balance but because it has forgotten movement entirely. Its atmosphere is thick with carbon. Heat circulates not gently, but with violence. A greenhouse wrapped in sulfuric clouds. Its surface burns with the memory of something it can no longer return to. Did Venus once tilt? Once turn like Earth? Once balance its seasons before something shifted, before rotation slowed, before its atmosphere locked it into a mirror that only reflects itself? We don't know, but we wonder. And then there's Uranus, a planet that spins on its side, axis tilted at 98 degrees. Its poles face the sun in long, strange seasons, each lasting over 20 Earth years. One hemisphere basks in light while the other lies in shadow for a generation. Then they switch. This tilt is a mystery, perhaps the result of a collision, perhaps a natural evolution of its orbital resonance. But the result is striking. A world in which the meaning of direction becomes abstract, where equator and pole are almost interchangeable, where rings and moons orbit sideways, and still it exists, turns. It holds itself in a rhythm we have yet to fully comprehend. So perhaps Earth is not alone in its instability. Perhaps tilt is not failure, but expression. A planetary mood, a gravitational poem, a celestial sympathy. Each planet carries its own version of imbalance. Each one whispers of the possibilities that Earth, too, might face. Not as punishment but as possibility. Because in these alien worlds, we see echoes of potential futures. Earth could wobble like Mars, could stagnate like Venus, could tumble sideways like Uranus. And yet Earth remains balanced for now, stabilized by its moon, heated just enough by its Sunday spinning in a rhythm that gives rise to forests, oceans, cities, sleep. But even this is not permanent. Our moon drifts away slowly. Our tilt continues its precessional circle. Our orbit changes shape subtly over tens of thousands of years. We are not fixed. We are only pausing between motions. And so we look to the others, not with fear, but with curiosity. Not to predict our fall, but to remember that change is everywhere. That what seems unusual here is normal elsewhere. That we are not exempt from celestial experimentation. Maybe all planets tilt. Maybe all planets forget. Maybe the story of Earth is simply one chapter in a longer tale told across many skies. And in that telling, each world offers a metaphor. Mars reminds us that water can disappear. Venus reminds us that warmth, unchecked, can trap memory. Uranus reminds us that direction is relative, and time does not always move the way we expect. And Earth reminds us that balance is rare, that just enough tilt, just enough motion can give rise to life, and that perhaps, just perhaps, we are living in the delicate breath between extremes. And if these planets, so distant and strange, carry within them the memory of tilt, what might the cosmos itself be trying to teach us, one axis at a time? Maybe that balance is never solitary. Earth has always had a partner. Its silent twin, its bright companion in the dark. The moon, locked in a slow waltz, never turning its face away, always tugging gently at our oceans, our calendars, our sense of time. But if Earth tilts, truly tilts, does the moon shift with us? Would its pull stay the same? Would its rhythm break? Would the tides write new poetry on our shores? We often forget that the moon is not distant. It is close, cosmically speaking, intimate, as gravity kisses our oceans every hour. It lifts the seas and drops them back, writes pulses into our coasts, nudges Earth's rotation, slows the days, just a little more each century. And Earth responds, not in resistance but in relationship. Our planet's tilt is stabilized by the moon. Without it, Earth's axis would wobble wildly, like Mars. A few degrees, then dozens. Seasons collapsing into chaos. But the moon holds us still just enough. Just stable enough for life. So what happens when we tilt anyway? If the Earth's balance shifts due to deep interior forces, surface redistribution, or celestial nudges, would the moon follow? Would its orbit shift? Would its familiar presence grow strange? Maybe not suddenly. The moon is patient. But even small changes in Earth's tilt can alter the way we face it. The angle of moonlight, the height of tides, the way lunar gravity intersects with solar heat and shifting oceans. And suddenly, the moon's language changes. Tides no longer arrive when expected. Their heights grow erratic. Spring tides, those amplified surges when sun and moon align, might come more often or less or not at all. Neap tides, once gentle, might deepen or vanish. The tidal rhythm, which has shaped coastlines and calendars for millions of years, begins to stammer. And the beaches listen. Sandbars shift. Estuaries flood. Coral reefs, already strained, lose their predictable rise and fall. Coastal life, crabs, mollusks, nesting birds, find their cues blurred. Their clocks no longer match the waves. And in that disruption, new rhythms are born. Different lunar angles mean different reflections. New patterns of light. New windows of darkness. The moon, once a timekeeper, becomes a composer. Its pull not broken, just rewritten. Imagine standing on a shoreline where tides rise sideways, where high tide lasts for days, where the full moon glows lower in the sky than it ever has before, casting shadows where none were meant to be. Still the same moon, but it speaks a new dialect. And perhaps, beneath this reoriented sky, we learn to listen differently. Maybe we mark time not by tide tables, but by the drift of seafoam. Maybe coastal communities invent new rituals, new moon songs, not based on prediction, but observation. Maybe our mythologies shift again, aligning with this altered pull. Because the moon has always shaped our stories. Its phases, its eclipses, its gentle disappearance and return. All metaphors for change, for cycles, for rebirth. A tilted Earth doesn't remove the moon. It reintroduces it, makes us look again, feel again, adapt again. Even the land feels the shift. The moon's gravitational pull doesn't stop at the sea. It lifts the solid Earth by centimeters. Quiet tides in rock called earth tides. With a changed tilt, these two would vary. Fault lines might flex differently. Magma may shift just slightly. Another whisper in the language of moons and masses. And perhaps the moon, too, would remember. In ancient craters, in its own slow spin, in the ghost of the tidal bulge it carries, locked forever facing Earth, it holds the shape of our planet's past. The fossil tides, the rhythm of a world before the tilt. So if the moon has always been a mirror, what do we reflect now? Planet leaning sideways, still spinning, still listening, still pulling oceans close and letting them go. And if the moon's song changes in return, what kind of stories might we tell when the tides no longer rhyme? Perhaps the same stories plants have been whispering since the beginning. Quiet ones, made of reaching, of waiting, of turning toward light. But what happens when the light arrives from the wrong direction? What does a seed do when the sun rises in the north? On a tilted Earth, where east is no longer east, where the arc of the sky no longer follows the familiar path, plants become the first to notice. They do not complain. They do not resist. But they respond. Light is their language. Not just warmth, but orientation, direction, timing. A seed doesn't simply grow. It decides when to grow, when to sleep, when to bloom, all based on the subtle cues of a changing sky. This is phototropism, the ability of plants to turn toward light. It's more than instinct. It's biology. Cells stretch on one side, pulling stems and leaves toward brightness. Roots respond to gravity. Shoots respond to sun. But if the sun begins to rise in unfamiliar places, the balance falters. Imagine a field of sunflowers facing northeast instead of east, confused as dawn lingers at the wrong angle. Imagine seeds germinating too early, triggered by a sun that no longer moves with the seasons. Imagine trees blooming in winter, vines spiraling in the wrong direction. Light tells plants what time it is, and when that message changes, so does everything else. Some adapt. Wild species adjust their growing seasons. They bend toward light no matter where it comes from. They wait longer before budding. They flower faster when needed. Plants, unlike us, do not ask why. They simply change. But agriculture is less forgiving. Domesticated crops are tuned to human calendars. They've been selected not for flexibility, but for yield, for timing, for tradition. A wheat variety that thrives under one length of daylight may fail entirely under another. Corn that needs predictable heat may falter under constant, slanted sun. And so we face the slow unraveling of the food web, not through storm, not through drought, but through disorientation. Pollinators miss their cues. Fruit ripens without flavor. Fields bloom too early, then freeze, or bloom too late and never seed. The rhythm is gone. The harmony between soil, sun, and season begins to fray. And yet, life doesn't stop. New weeds rise. Invasive plants spread into unfamiliar zones. Crops begin to crossbreed with wild cousins in search of lost resilience. In laboratories and gardens, we learn from the plants that continue to grow. Not the biggest, not the most profitable, but the most responsive. Because biology remembers something we forget. Direction is not fixed. It's interpreted. And light, even when it moves unpredictably, is still a message worth listening to. We begin to redesign. Not just what we grow, but how we grow. Greenhouses that mimic old patterns of light. Artificial sunsets for crops that miss the dark. Indoor vertical farms, tuned not to the planet's axis, but to programmable dawns. Seeds genetically adapted for longer days or skewed seasons. A strange agriculture emerges, not rooted in soil, but in understanding. In conversation. Between species, between technologies, between sun and cell. And outside the walls of innovation, wild plants continue their quiet work. Mosses growing sideways along rocks that now face south instead of east. Trees leaning toward a light they've never followed before. Algae blooming in new bands of warmth. Seeds carried by wind into climates they weren't meant for, germinating anyway. There is grief, yes, for lost harvests. For traditions that no longer align, for plants that cannot reorient fast enough. But there is awe too, because even when light turns strange, life reaches toward it. Even when seasons lose their names, roots still seek water, leaves still turn. Photosynthesis continues, silent, invisible, unwavering. And maybe that's the lesson of seeds in the wrong direction. That life does not need perfect instructions. Only a signal, only a possibility, only the faintest hint of where growth might be found. And as we walk these shifting fields, watching plants reach toward an unfamiliar sky, we may begin to ask, if a seed can find its way without a map, what might we remember about our own ability to adapt? And what might be remembered of us? Not by story, not by myth, but by stone. If the earth tilts, if seasons shatter, seas wander, and ice grows backward, what record will we leave behind? What mark will this moment make in the layers of time, pressed between epochs like a petal caught between pages? Because every age becomes a layer, every layer becomes a chapter, and every chapter eventually becomes a fossil. We think of fossils as ancient fragments of creatures long vanished, etched into rock with the patience of pressure and time. But fossilization isn't only for bones. It can hold leaves, feathers, footprints, the contents of a last meal, a moment of stillness turned into permanence. So how would the future read our stillness? What would a tilted world discover, centuries or eons from now, as it reads the strata left by this human moment? There would be signs, unmistakable ones. A sudden spike in carbon, a layer rich in plastics, colorful polymers pressed into sediment like confetti, traces of concrete, steel, rare earth metals, isotopes from nuclear tests, smeared into soils around the globe. microplastics embedded in fish bones, pollen from monoculture crops scattered far from their native climates, our fingerprints fossilized. Some have named this the Anthropocene, a proposed epoch defined not by what the Earth has done, but by what we have done to it. Our cities, our machines, our waste, our rearrangement of rivers, forests, coastlines. But those records won't read like a journal. They'll read like a puzzle. In a tilted Earth, where land has moved and climates have reversed, our remnants may seem misplaced. Parking lot beneath a jungle, a plastic bottle beneath a glacier, solar panels buried beneath dunes, entire neighborhoods preserved in silt, flattened by water or ash or time. Would they know what we meant? Would a future being recognize a city street as a form of movement, a landfill as a form of memory, a tablet of glass and circuitry as a container for thought? Or would our traces confuse them? Technology without context, bones without ritual, architecture without orientation. Fossils do not tell stories. They suggest them. The shape of a limb, the curve of a tool, the absence of predators, the abundance of one plant over another. These are not facts. They are fragments, clues, memory distilled and rearranged by pressure. And yet, there's something tender about the idea that the future might hold us, piece by piece. A boot print fossilized beside the track of a fox. A child's toy, melted and reshaped by sediment. A fossilized wall etched with graffiti in a language no longer spoken. A meal half-eaten, carbonized, preserved. Not because we were special, not because we lasted, but because we happened, because we pressed into the earth with enough weight to be remembered. And if the world tilts, if poles become tropics, if oceans shift, if plants reach toward unfamiliar suns, then these fossils of us may appear in places we never imagined. A satellite buried beneath a limestone overhang. A steel beam embedded in clay. The geological signature of our cities mapped like coral reefs. Complex, layered, abandoned, persistent. And perhaps someone or something will kneel beside a fragment of our world, brush away dust, and wonder, who were they? What did they believe? Why did they change the world the way they did? They may never know our names, but they may know our scale, our speed, our reach, and maybe, if they listen closely enough, they'll hear the quiet contradiction in our layer, that we were capable of great complexity and great forgetting, that we made beauty and waste, meaning and noise, often in the same breath. And still, beneath it all, there will be evidence that we tried to understand, tried to preserve, tried to adapt, even when the sky changed, even when the tide came in too high, even when the ice crept across our memories. We may be remembered not for our certainty, but for our effort. And that, too, can fossilize. So if the future reads us through tilted stone, if our era becomes a brittle chapter in the long, slow archive of the planet, perhaps they'll understand that we lived in a moment of turning, and that even in collapse we looked for ways to grow, but not always downward into the soil, sometimes upward, into the dark. Because even when earth leans, and oceans shift, and memory melts from stone, the stars remain, or seem to. They shimmer above us like they always have, cool, steady, beyond reach. But something has changed. Not them exactly, but us, our posture beneath the sky, our angle, our gaze. On a tilted earth, the constellations begin to drift. Slowly, strangely, the shapes we once trusted to return each season appear out of place. Orion leans too far. The Southern Cross rises too high. Polaris no longer points north. The celestial sphere turns unfamiliar. And we, the storytellers beneath it, begin to feel a quiet displacement. Because the sky has never only been stars. It has been myth, meaning, direction, a map for navigation and imagination alike. Farmers once sowed fields by the position of the Pleiades. Sailors charted unknown waters by the arc of Ursa Major. Children listened to legends passed down across centuries, tied to those familiar patterns of light. If constellations twist, do the stories twist too? Does a lion become a serpent? A hunter become a stranger? Does the myth hold if the stars forget how to form it? Perhaps the shapes bend, but the impulse remains. We've always looked up and seen more than light. We've drawn our stories into the sky not because the stars needed them, but because we did. To find comfort in repetition. To place ourselves in something vast. But on a tilted earth, repetition falters. The sidereal clock ticks out of sync. Equinoxes arrive late. Celestial events no longer match the rituals built around them. Temples once aligned to solstices cast shadows in the wrong direction. Sacred skies become misaligned with sacred days. And so the myths begin to wander. Not disappear, just drift, like the stars themselves. Perhaps they migrate. Stories once told in the north are now whispered in the south. Perhaps they evolve. A once still constellation becomes a traveler, a god of changing directions. A hero falls sideways through the heavens, his path altered by the tilt of the earth he protects. Even now, our myths have changed with the stars. The pole star was not always Polaris. Thousands of years ago, it was Thuban. Thousands of years from now, it will be Vega. Each pole star carried by the slow dance of axial precession. And each era built its cosmology around a different anchor. So maybe we adapt again. Maybe we don't stop looking up. Maybe we look differently. We trace new lines between unfamiliar stars. We give them names rooted in the present. Names that carry our changing hopes, our newer fears. The constellations of a tilted earth may not be ancient, but they will be ours. And yet, something deeper persists. Even if the shapes disappear, the habit remains. The habit of gazing, of reaching, of asking what lies beyond. Because to watch the stars go sideways is to witness time made visible. To feel the axis of the earth beneath your feet not as a fact, but as a sensation. A tilt that touches the spine of the sky. A reminder that we, too, are moving even when we feel still. And maybe that's the heart of it. The stars don't need to stay where they are to carry meaning. They only need to remind us that we're part of something larger. That we live beneath a sky that notices us, reflects us, reframes us, and when it changes, we do too. We retell, we redraw, we reinvent the heavens to match the angle of our questions. So when the sky begins to turn sideways, when familiar figures slant and scatter, we may gather again, as we always have, and ask, "What do you see now?" And someone quietly will begin a new story, because the stories don't end. They rearrange. They drift with the constellations, echo through fossils, melt through ice, and settle again, quietly, into the bones of the earth. And what is Earth if not a planet made of memory? Every layer, every grain, every isotopic trace is a whisper of warmth, of cold, of flood and fire, of what lived, of what vanished, of what changed without asking permission. So much of what we call solid is actually story. Stratigraphy is the arrangement of time in matter. Sand turned to stone, dust to shale, volcanic ash layered like punctuation, isotopes decaying, marking invisible clocks, the rise and fall of carbon, the breath of ancient atmospheres held in limestone, in coal, in coral. And if you listen softly enough, the planet speaks. Speaks not in language, but in pattern. A sequence of minerals hinting at past oceans. A sudden absence of pollen in a sediment core. A frozen ripple from a lake that dried too quickly. A band of iridium that remembers an impact no one saw. All of it memory, and all of it imperfect. Because memory even here fades. Pressure folds rock. Subduction pulls layers beneath the crust. Glaciers grind time into powder. Erosion carries history grain by grain into rivers, into seas. Most things vanish. Only fragments remain, but even fragments tell. A single grain of sand contains a record of its journey. How far it traveled, what mountains it came from, how long it rolled, tumbled, waited. Its edges, sharp or smooth, tell us whether it knew violence or calm. Even the way it reflects light can whisper something of the heat it once held. And then there are the isotopes, invisible to the eye, but pulsing with information. Decay chains of uranium into lead, potassium into argon, ratios that shift like the fading of a heartbeat, clocks that do not tick, but drift, measuring not seconds, but silences between events. These are the ways Earth remembers the tilt. Not with a monument, not with a line in the sand, but with a rebalancing of all things: heat, pressure, rhythm, residue. A shift in tilt changes sunlight. That sunlight alters wind. The wind changes currents. Currents change chemistry. Chemistry changes life. And life, in turn, leaves its own record. A coral reef that grows faster in warmer years. A tree ring that thickens, then shrinks. A sudden bloom of species followed by a collapse. Then another quiet. Even the magnetic field holds traces. In hardened lava, iron particles align with Earth's field as it existed the day they cooled. A frozen compass. Reversed sometimes. Split. Stretched. Signs that the core trembled, that the axis danced. Each one a mark. A memory. A note in a planetary song composed not in melody, but in mineral. And yet, for all these clues, the Earth does not remember with clarity. It remembers with persistence. What survives is what is recorded by accident. A footprint hardened by ash. A bone fossilized by luck. A climate recorded because a cave dripped in rhythm. We remember the tilt only because something shifted enough to be noticed and preserved. And that makes you wonder, how much have we already forgotten? How many tilts left no trace? How many rhythms changed and changed again, without sediment to hold the shape? What other worlds has this Earth already been, erased not by catastrophe but by time? And if we could dig deep enough, not into rock, but into the silence between layers, what would we hear? Maybe nothing. Maybe only the weight of it all. The compression. The gravity. The slow settling of moments into matter. Or maybe we'd hear something else. Not words. Not names. But a kind of resonance. A memory older than language. The feeling of something shifting. Of something once known. Then tilted just enough to be forgotten. And still life grew. Still rivers carved valleys. Forests stretched. Ice turned upward. Stories were told. Time passed. Because even on a planet tilted sideways, the core continues to turn. Heat continues to rise. Memory continues to settle. The planet does not ask to be remembered. It simply endures. And in enduring, it remembers everything. Even us. Even the briefness of us. The movement. The reaching. The noise. And the pause that followed. Because if the Earth tilted fully, strangely, and if we adapted, if we rewrote our calendars and rebuilt our stories, if we wandered beneath new constellations and learned to plant seeds that listen to a different sun, would stillness return? Not the stillness of ending, but of balance, of something settling into a new shape. It's possible. We imagine change as chaos, collapse, motion that never stops. But not all movement ends in fire. Sometimes it leads to stillness, not because everything returns to what it was, but because it finds what it's become. Tilt, after all, is not destruction. It's reorientation. It's direction, misunderstood. The Earth might spin sideways. The sky might drift. The oceans might lose their rhythm. But over time, new rhythms form. New orbits of life. New adaptations. New silences. And in those silences, stillness waits. Imagine a distant future, not of catastrophe, but of quiet. A planet no longer confused by the tilt, but grown into it. Children born under a sun that stands high for weeks, or disappears for months, who've never known another sky. Crops that bloom according to moonlight, not month. Myths drawn not from the stars we knew, but from those that rose in our absence. Not broken, not barren, just different. A different kind of order, tilted peace. Time, too, might change, not in speed but in sensation. We measure time by what moves. The hands of a clock, the arc of a shadow, the rise and fall of days. But what happens when those markers fade? When dusk comes sideways or not at all? When shadows stand still? Maybe time becomes internal, measured in memory, in heartbeat, in the slow unfolding of presence. Maybe we learn to live in it, not chase it, to sit longer, to notice more, to listen to a planet that no longer spins the way it once did, but still turns. And entropy, that slow erosion of all structure, continues not in violence, but in peace. Leaves fall, mountains soften, heat spreads, order relaxes, not because the world is dying, but because it is exhaling. Because that is what all systems do eventually, they rest. And maybe we learn to rest with it. This isn't a world of apocalypse. It's a world of softness, a pale light, of new equilibrium. It's the hush that follows the long song of becoming. Not the end of curiosity, but the quiet it leaves behind when it has become content. Because perhaps the final shape of wonder is stillness. Not knowing more, not chasing farther, but sitting within the mystery, letting it hum around you like a warm current, letting the questions stay unanswered because they're beautiful that way. We may not know what would truly happen if Earth tilted 90 degrees. Not entirely. Science can model, myth can imagine, but the full truth lives in the space between, where geology becomes metaphor and data becomes dream. We've wandered far, together, through molten cores and memory-soaked fossils, through moonscapes and magnetic fields, through entropy and adaptation and stories told beneath unfamiliar stars, through dust and water and light that comes from the wrong direction. And always, we have returned to one quiet truth. This planet remembers. Not in words, not in lines, but in layers, in pressure, in change. It holds what it's been. It adapts. It endures. And maybe we are part of that endurance. Maybe we, too, are a kind of memory. Our cities, our questions, our reaching toward light, no matter where it rises. Our stories, folded into stone, into seeds, into myth. And when the tilt finally settles, when the spin becomes silence, when the sky no longer turns as it once did, stillness might arrive, not as erasure, but as peace, not as the end of the world, but as its breath, the kind you take after you've survived something large, the kind you take before something new begins, the kind that doesn't need to be explained, just felt, just held, just quiet.